Right, let's dive in. So building processes that survive contact with reality, what are we talking about here? So I think broadly, like a lot of things at the moment are changing in the world of incident management. So there's like a ton of new sort of approaches to running and learning from incidents being adopted, and things that people have been like doing and data they've been looking at for many years are sort of being proven to be like either ineffective in some regards or like actively harmful in other regards. But with like so much change going on, it can be like an absolute minefield knowing sort of where to focus and where we should be actually looking on these things. So this panel sort of came about because we want to look at like how we can bring in some of those processes and look at how we're evolving things, but in a way that sort of actually survives contact reality. So no kind of like spouting from the sort of pulpit and being like, this is how everyone should do things without practical guidance of like how we should do it kind of thing. And we have like an incredible panel here of absolute experts in their field, like genuinely really appreciative for you folks to be here. And we're going to sort of go through a few different topics here. Before we dive in, let's do a quick round of intros. So Uma, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Until recently, I led engineering at a Series B startup called Render. It's a platform as a service. So, you can imagine we're a platform serving thousands of users, each trying to do very different things. And very early on when I joined, I was actually like an early incident user because I realized we didn't have the software we needed to manage all the incidents we were seeing. Prior to that, I was at Stripe for 3 years, and I actually have a hot take that fintech has the most interesting incidents, which is why I believe incident exists as well. And before that, I was at VMware and Delphix, always infra in different forms.
Nice, go for Dawer.
Hello everyone, my name is Dawer Jung. I'm at Netflix working in the game side of things as a game reliability manager. It's really about ensuring that our players have a great and like stable experience and pun intended, reliable experience. Been there for about almost a year now, really building and working with folks in the greater streaming business as well on their already awesomely built incident process as well, and kind of putting that kind of games flavor to things. Prior to that, I was at Epic Games, and previously I was at like a Web3 company, but also at Riot Games as well, where I was there helping launch a lot of their titles post League of Legends, but also looking after League of Legends. Prior to that, about 15 years of experience in both managed services as well as like organizations like Cisco and Symantec, as well as in IT as well. So it's an interesting mix of like coming from IT and regular IT, and then putting that kind of gaming, and then now to like the Netflix side of things. Netflix is a very different culture and how they approach things in general, and so that's been a really, really good learning. And so, but also gaming is a totally different type of customer as well as and expectations. And so that's been super interesting as well. But spent a lot of that time in the whole, obviously iTool world, used a lot of incident tools. Not all of them are great. And so it's been really interesting to kind of see this journey of people going from managing tickets to actually being able to manage the incident and focus less on actual, I've got, like what Stephen was saying, fill in 24 different fields. No one likes that, especially in companies where it's really about not slowing the business down just because something's gone wrong, and really trying to focus on that proactivity as well. Thank you.
Go for Colette.
Hi, I'm Colette. I'm a director of engineering at HashiCorp of our SRE and observability teams. Before I was at HashiCorp, I worked at a company called Cognite in Oslo, Norway. Before that, I was at Spotify, and that's kind of where I got really interested in reliability and especially learning from incidents. I have like a 12, 13-year career in tech, so it goes back a ways. Before that, I was a professional cellist in rock bands, so I have what's called an alternative background for engineering leaders. I just got my Master's of Science in Human Factors and System Safety from Lund University. I'm following in the footsteps of my friend and mentor, John Alspa, and many other people, including J. Paul Reed, who's in the audience. So I love to talk about learning from incidents.
That is a good thing. So a quick picture of hands, like how many people are aware of the kind of concept of resilience engineering? Amazing. Well, it's going to be a great conversation. Colette, I know this is a thing that you care about a ton, and I think you have a super interesting background, right? As you said, have like the academic sort of side and the things from Lund, right, which is super interesting, like have clearly studied and thought about this stuff from like that angle. But being a director of SRE like at HashiCorp, that is pretty much as real as sharp end as it gets, right? And I guess like we've spoken about resilience engineering in the past. I wonder if you can, like, for anyone who hasn't sort of heard of it, like, what is your definition of like resilience engineering? Like, how do you think about it? And like, what is like a practical way in which it can be applied in like an organization like HashiCorp, for example?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in sort of the academic sense, resilience engineering has evolved through a long practice of safety that goes back to like the 1920s, really, when we look at safety in work. And it arose as a conceptual way to reframe how we look at safety, which isn't through the lens of what did somebody do wrong or what was the bad thing that happened, but rather what do people do that is right? Whether you're having an incident, whether you're not having an incident, what's really happening on the ground, how are people working, and how do we grow the strengths that all people who are working on the ground have that prevent us from having incidents every day, right? So I think that's kind of where resilience engineering conceptually comes from. I think how I think about practicing it, certainly at HashiCorp and really at Spotify too, was around kind of looking at incidents and doing deeper dives, kind of getting beyond what a lot of people refer to as shallow data about incidents, and doing these, what we call in-depth incident analyses, right? Which is kind of getting really into the heads of the engineers on the ground. What do they know about the systems and what's going wrong? And using the incident report as a way to transmit knowledge that's inside of engineers' heads. Like, we often forget this, right? But what we are expert in, we don't really know. We don't have that outside perspective of what it is we are truly expert in. Other people might really gain a lot from learning, right? So when we do these in-depth incident analyses, what you see really is the mountains of information inside of engineers' heads coming out onto paper and being disseminated throughout an organization. And to me, that's a huge benefit and boost for the resilience of any organization.
Nice. I guess to put like a super like practical point on it, if there was like one practice that you were like, hey, everyone, leave this conference, here's the thing that you should take away from resilience engineering. You're smiling. Like, is there a thing? Is there like one thing that you'd be like, this, you know, just go and do this, and you'll see some benefits, some returns, some value from it?
So I'm gonna steal something from Allspa here, because I think like John Allspa, who invented DevOps and blameless platforms and, you know, yada yada. Hi, John. So in-depth incident analysis is 100% the one practice that I try to bring with me to every organization that I lead in, right? Because I think it's so valuable for the people who work in it. You need to be trained in how to do it, and you can't do an in-depth analysis for every single incident. But what you can do is you can start by separating the kind of like action item-y or post-mortem process, which is a little bit different, right, than the learning part. Try to make them two separate meetings, right? Get your action items out of the way, maybe after you've done a section, an hour together where you're learning, where you're just trying to get information out of people's heads about what they know about what happened during the incident. Then do action items a couple days later. Because your action items, A, are gonna get a lot better, because everybody in the room will suddenly have a shared understanding of the incident that they didn't have before. And B, like, you're basically just improving the amount, even if you're not necessarily documenting that meeting, you're improving the amount of knowledge that's being shared in your org. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. I guess like Dawer, Uma, your experiences?
I mean, I love the idea of being able to do that. My worry would be that in a very fast-paced sort of, so I ran engineering starting at 8 to 9 people and then grew to 55. There were definitely times in our era where we had more incidents per week than engineers. So in that,
yeah,
you know, and in that sort of scenario, I can't imagine having, honestly, the time to be able to have separate meetings.
But maybe just like pick one where you do that, right? And I think that's the thing. This isn't like you have to do it for every single one. It's you can kind of pick the most interesting one, or maybe even the least interesting one, and find out it's more interesting than he thought it was.
Interesting. Yeah, it's thinking about like Andrew's talk earlier, where it's like have objective criteria for things. It's like it sounds like maybe the answer is like maybe don't do that if you are time constrained and things, and don't try and do it for everything. But like as you say, like pick something, go deep, and figure out how valuable that is. Is that fair?
Yeah, I also think there's this thing about time, right? Like, how many people here do code review? Like have a code review practice that's like mandated in their company, right? I think even smaller startups have that. Code review takes a lot of time. And we still do it, and we don't really question it, right? And I think that my question is, like, can you add one more hour to your post-incident process if you're going to magnify, even if it's just for one incident a month, even if you're going to magnify the value that you get out of it?
Yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense. I guess I often think about like this kind of concept of learning and like the focal point being like the post-incident review. And I think in a lot of the organizations I've worked in, a lot of the learning happens like sort of implicitly and around the edges and things like that. And so I've been in organizations where we haven't had that kind of like go deep and do the thing, but like the team ends up like chatting over lunch, right? And that's where I found actually a ton of the value is, which is like get people together. If they're like-minded and they all want to build like reliable systems, that's the kind of the secret sauce. And so I've been quite comfortable kind of like not mandating deep incident reviews. Like how do you think about that? Is that like would you say like good approach, bad approach? I'm curious.
I mean, I don't know if it's an approach that scales with an organization of
course,
1,200 or 3,000. And I think like, but I do think like there is, you know, when we talk about processes or things that we're trying to apply, like my general take is like most processes that you're going to mandate from above are probably not necessarily valuable to your organization in terms of increasing its resilience. The things that people are already doing on the ground, talking at the water cooler, talking at lunch, talking in Slack, like, you know, about something that happened, that's the kind of stuff you can magnify too, right?
Yeah, 100%, 100%. I guess if you were to look at resilience engineering as like a broader practice and look at the sort of the as yet unsolved parts of it that you haven't yet been able to be like, here's a way that we can sort of operationalize inside an organization, is there something that comes to mind there for you?
I don't know that, I mean, from an academic perspective, I think resilience engineering is a very young field. It's only been around for 20 years. And I don't think software has really been participating that much, like maybe a little bit over the last, what do you think, J. Paul, 10? Like, yeah. So I don't know that that it's solved much, right? But I do think it's raised very interesting questions. Like one of the reasons you don't hear people talking about mean time to recovery right now very much is probably largely due to the folks who are participating in the resilience engineering movement, who basically did a lot of work, Courtney Nash, like a bunch of other people, to say this is horseshit, like these statistics don't mean anything. And I mean, you know, so I think that it's had an impact already in terms of like how it's affected our field. What we haven't solved is like, I don't know, name any problem on the ground for how do any organizations understand what makes them more resilient or less resilient? How can any leaders tell from where they're sitting where they are on a spectrum of less resilient or more resilient? Or what are the things, there's a really great paper called Going Solid that calls upon a nuclear term, which is essentially when I think the core melts down or something, but the idea of an organization going solid, becoming more brittle to stresses that are happening. Do any of your engineering leaders know what those signals are? Do we have an understood language among all of us about when our organizations are getting pushed closer to that line of being brittle and unable to withstand anymore? That's where I think we need to go.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. I think the MTTR thing is a very relevant conversation for me anyway. So totally aligned. But I think this is one area where we have so much work to do, because whilst it gets a chuckle in the room here and everyone's like, yeah, obviously don't look at MTTR. The vast majority of organizations I speak to, there are a bunch of people who are still like, does your product have the graph that shows me MTTR, for example, that's the thing I'm trying to drive down. There is a lot of education, I feel like, yet to be done in organizations.
I think there's an anchoring here of why are we doing these things?
Yeah.
Why does it matter? I think for me, it's, like you said, I worked in organizations where it's very much all these MTTX metrics, whereas in the past 6-7 years, it's really been more rooted around what's the impact of the customer experience or the player experience, depending on the kind of company you work for. At the end of the day, these things all need to be, in my opinion, need to be in service of those things. In terms of let's look at the customer experience. What are customers telling us? Where are the problem areas? Okay, where do we need to either be more resilient, more stable in that respect, and where do we need to spend those calories? Because there's a lot of just hearing all the previous talks before me. There's a lot of stuff like what should we measure and whatnot. I think and on the topic of celebrating successes, how many minutes are we saving? How many incidents are we preventing? How have Andrew's example, how many times have our canary services identified an issue that we normally would not have seen, and how has that impacted the customer experience? Because at the end of the day, to be blunt, they're the people paying our checks, right? And so that's an area that I've really been focused on as well, and that's why I question the teams in terms of okay, you want to do this thing, but what's the impact, positive to our customers as a result of you putting in these calories? And then also what things can we put in place to also protect that time? Because from an engineering standpoint, you want your engineers to be focused working on features and cool things that are going to either enhance your product, et cetera, et cetera. There's that time that they have to budget for to a certain degree to deal with incidents. And I think all of us can agree we want to minimize that time as much as possible, that toil required. And so resilience engineering is a big factor in terms of getting towards that. And it's kind of dovetails into what Stephen was talking about before in terms of, how do we build those structures in order to enable that? Because at the end of the day, technology, they're enablers for us, right? And so how do we leverage this to put those in the right areas in service of what our goals are?
For sure. Might have to move us on unless there's any final thoughts on resilience engineering. Colette, I imagine you have many.
Yeah, I think, we were talking about this a little bit at dinner last night, and my favorite sort of way to describe the theory to practice problem is the meme, you all might know this, of how to draw an owl with 2 circles and then draw the rest of the fucking owl. And I sometimes feel there are these concepts that are very up here, and we are down here in our context all the time. And I think, I would just say, don't ever underestimate your ability to translate those things for your reality. And just because they don't work one time doesn't mean they won't work another time or won't work a week later. I think be willing to experiment like the scientists that we all are, right, when we're doing this stuff. That's all I would say.
I love that. I think that's super pragmatic, which is a lot of this stuff no one has answers for right now, but it's I reckon we can figure it out if we try things. That's how things have happened in the past.
Yeah.
Super interesting. I imagine lots of people will probably want to continue the conversation. There's lots of time later today. But let's move us on. So I want to talk a little bit about applying local context to the kind of things that we're doing here. And I think sometimes these things introduce a bunch of friction in orgs where we don't apply that local context. So a great example here is I think most people in this room, or most engineers, can kind of intuit which practices from a Google-sized organization will apply to a 10-person startup, and which ones are cool, well, maybe one day if we are some Goliath that prints money, essentially. But I feel in incident management, we haven't quite built that muscle memory up, or those reps up to be hey, that's really cool, and I can imagine that works. And a great example is that maybe the one you gave, Colette, which is the deep, investigation into an incident. Now, if I'm a 5-person startup and I'm default dead, right? Maybe that is a thing where I'm I should apply some context and use the round the lunch table mechanism as my way of being able to learn and distribute that knowledge amongst people. And I guess Uma, you have worked Stripe, pretty big company, and then Render, a much smaller company. What's your take on that kind of angle?
So I already shared the constraints, which is sometimes we had more incidents than people, and I think that my sort of I actually asked around a bit at that time, how are people scaling incident investigation or incident debriefs, and I got a lot of sort of advice where I was told everything from, as the eng leader, you should absolutely not be in the room when the incidents are being discussed. And I can get that, why that might, create a more blameful environment at an environment like Google. But there is literally no one else to facilitate the meeting at a 9-person or 15-person startup that we were. So I was like, yes, I get where this is coming from, but that's not my reality. Or the other one is like, you should sort of have an objective criteria and then decide on that and then go into the details. So that's where my approach is we should actually use the fact that we're a startup to our advantage, where these practices were built to scale for thousands of engineers, where it's hard to sort of decide, what it means because you have so many different things going on, versus when you have a few dozen people and, a handful of incidents or dozens of incidents even I actually know which ones are more interesting and which ones are not. So sort of, turning the fact that we are a startup into a superpower. Like I know, for instance, that this incident caused 0 downtime, was like over in 5 minutes, but exposed a really corner case. So we're going to discuss that. Versus, this one caused a massive outage, but was like, resolved immediately, and everyone knows exactly what happened. So we're still going to discuss it. The other interesting thing is, where do you decide postmortems versus not? I thought Andrew made a really good point, which is, like you have to sort of give engineers the ownership and have them decide which ones they spend time discussing. And the other angle I'll add is, which he also alluded to, which is the postmortem process itself can feel punitive. So if you say, oh, you were in an incident, great, now you have to spend an hour writing the report, that's going to actually disincentivize people from even calling an incident the next time. So you have to sort of be very careful of the incentives that you set in place. So using the fact that, you can be a lot more subjective in a smaller, fast-moving environment, and really grounding it. I think you made a really good point earlier, like what's the value? Like what's the ultimate value you're trying to provide? Grounding it in like what's the customer impact? And then we sort of had this vague metric called interestingness, like the one I gave before. It's like, oh, it's this like random thing. And the other thing I found that was really useful was I would actually just allow engineers to nominate incidents themselves. So you decide collectively in the weekly meeting which ones we discuss versus which ones we don't. And so there was a collective sort of upward, downward process that we would say like, oh, we want to discuss, we'd have a list and we'd actually, people would just be like, oh yeah, this was straightforward, let's skip it, versus this one was, priority 3, but was actually really interesting. So I think using that sort of subjective analysis versus trying to borrow purely like the objective criteria that works at scale is what worked for us.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense to me. You've reminded me actually of like, I remember in a past life working in a financial institution, some of the the gnarly big incidents where you had to produce like public postmortems for, you'd have these very formal processes and you'd go and tick the boxes and write the report and stuff. And then we'd have these other like inconsequential incidents where a bunch of engineers sat on beanbags in like the ground floor of our office. And like the stark difference in the type of conversation you have and the type of like sharing you have is like vast. And no one mandates that you sit on beanbags and have those kind of conversations, but they're super interesting, right? I guess, Dawer, Colette, any thoughts on this sort of, applying local context kind of thing?
I'm a pretty, keep it simple, stupid kind of person. So when it comes to, postmortems and things like that, it's just about how can I use what's at hand to make it a very frictionless as possible, quick thing. Because at the end of the day, the only things I really care about for a post-mortem, and feel free to shoot me down, is why did it happen? What's the timeline generally? Most importantly, what are the follow-up actions, and who's owning those, and when are they going to be done by? And that's it. And generally, I'd want all that kind of to be initially fleshed out before the meeting, because those meetings can become very expensive, depending, obviously, if it's a SEV1 or whatnot, right? So really trying to be respectful of people's time. I'm all about really focusing on protecting engineers' time so they can focus on doing the cool stuff. And so it's really that kind of simple thing. And I'm not going to plug incident.io here, but the automated version of actually being able to generate that PIR in incident.io saves a lot of time for us. And it really, like you said, incentivizes people to be like, oh, I'm going to look at this because I don't have to write it. I just have to review it, and then it's going to come to a meeting, and that's fine. Instead of asking a person to go, well, let's all do this thing by committee that's going to take 4 hours to do, very onerous, when they could have been spending that 4 hours working on this cool new feature. And so it's really hard to like make that case to the respective engineering managers, et cetera, as well. So just that simple approach. And I am pushing your teams to make it better. It's good, but right now, for me, the most important thing is follow-ups. What's the best way for me to track follow-ups? I haven't found a good solution for that, because if all that gets made, and we're in a meeting, and we're like, okay, cool, we've got the follow-ups from the incident in the Slack channel, I'll put the little fast forward emoji, sweet, it's in there, I have a list now. Okay, how do I track those? Do we put them into Jira via API? Do we store it in a separate page or something? And so these are the kind of things that we're like, okay, how do we save time on this, but still get to the outcomes that we need?
Mm-hmm. Colette, you were smiling through all of that.
Oh, I was going to say, so I think one of the best decisions I ever made as a manager at the smallest place I've ever worked was, I came in and they were mandating postmortems for every single incident. And I was like, this is really, and shockingly, there weren't very many incidents. I know, you'd be so surprised to hear that. And so when I came in and I suggested that, hey, maybe we shouldn't mandate postmortems, and it should just be if engineers are curious or feel like it's important to follow up, or if a leader is like, that was the SEV1, maybe we should follow up. I guess maybe that will happen too, but hopefully not. And shockingly, we suddenly had more incidents, and there was more discussion and more learning. And so I think that's a good example of where letting go of process or enforcing something can actually help things move forward, I think, for the better. I'm curious, though, about the action items. Like, in your experience, Dawer, when you're tracking those if you were tracking those action items super effectively, what do you think would be the outcome of that?
Generally, I'd want to look at those action items and kind of make sure what are they trying to achieve. Like, is it going to apply, or is it going to result in better resilience in terms of like, hey, our stuff's going to fail less, or hey, or we're going to know sooner. Sometimes just decreasing either the time to know what is actually wrong, to then engage and page the right team at the right time. It's all kind of in service of that, as well as, okay, cool, well, again, like, what is the impact what's the benefit to the customer as a result of this, or benefit to the team or to the engineering team? Like, is this going to reduce their time spent on incident by 50% or something like that, right? Like, or whatnot. It's generally, those are the kinds of things that we're like, you want, just like alerts, you want them to be actionable. You want your follow-ups from incidents to actually be value, but also be actually actionable as well in that respect, not just like a bunch of fluff of like, okay, yeah, someone should look at alerting. Like, that's not good enough, right? So.
Yeah, no, totally. I find action items after incidents to be very frustrating, because so often so many of them don't get done. But I don't think that that's a sign that something's wrong. I think that's a sign that perhaps the action items, when they got generated, just maybe weren't the right ones. But it's like, how do I guess as a leader, I just remember this one person coming to me and being like, Colette, the incident happened again. And I was like, uh-huh. And they were like, an incident like this happened last summer, and I tracked all of the action items, and I made sure everybody followed up, and every engineering manager had a meeting with me until those action items were done. And I was like, uh-huh. and then what happened? He was like, it happened again. And I'm like, yes, it happened again. And there's nothing, to me, there's not a correlation between all of the action items getting completed and that incident won't happen again, or an incident like it won't happen again, or we're all totally safe. And so, I don't know, I constantly grapple with this desire that I and many other leaders I know have to track action items, with the fact that I just don't know that they always are, like, that tracking them gives us anything.
If I could add, I think I get the frustration, and I get the sort of, action items sort of go into this pile. I actually think Incident does a pretty good job of listing out, time, like the dashboards actually have these. So we use those, and I get it, and tying the action items back to sort of the learning, I actually think that what doesn't get talked about enough is how much you can learn from the follow-ups. So I think that's actually one of the big missing things, which is it's not just the postmortem and the meetings that you have, it's also the follow-ups. So the key thing I think as engineering leaders we need to do is give the team, one, the sort of the mandate that, the follow-ups are important, and give them the space to do the follow-ups. And that's where I actually believe, because that's the practice, that's where the actual learning is going to come from. And a big thing to your point, I get this sort of, it's a sort of tightrope between blame, keeping it blameless, but then also you do want a culture where you don't just see the same type of incident over and over again, because otherwise you're missing something critical. Like in the second, if it's repeated, my question would be, what did we miss the first time? Like, did the team not get the time to follow up? Did we not invest enough in sort of fixing the underlying things that broke the first time? Because the goal should actually be, more novel incidents versus more of the same incidents. And I think that's where you can actually tie the room for follow-ups and action items and giving the team the agency and ownership to invest in those so that they feel that, okay, they're actually not going to get woken up again for the same reason.
Which is a good candidate for that deeper incident analysis, right? Because if it happened again, something's maybe might have been different, but it's worth kind of maybe deep diving into, or a bit more maybe. But we can't. That's the thing. We can't prevent all incidents. Stuff's going to happen again. Like someone's going to forget to renew a SSL certificate or something, right? Like because they didn't put the alert in, or those things can repeat itself. But yeah, I get your frustration. It just feels bad not doing anything, just having incidents and just moving on. Right?
My hot take is why bother having a learning session if you're just going to ignore all the data you got from it and not do anything with it?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because how do you define? I happen to believe that most engineers do follow-up items to incidents kind of even before the postmortem happens. A lot of the really important follow-up incidents, action items, happen right after or during even the incident, right? And so that is sort of the idea that engineers are the source of the resilience in your organization. They are constantly taking action to keep you up all of the time. Means to me, if they're ignoring an action item or it's not getting done, maybe that's not the most important thing for them to be doing. And that leads me to think that maybe tracking action items is more about making us feel better as managers, right? And making us be able to tell a story to our leadership of I've got it under control, we're doing something about it. And if that's what it is, okay, that's fine, let's just admit it, right? But I don't know that it's actually improving the safety of our systems.
I just feel like we can't make a blanket statement about it because I think we all have action items. We've all been in incidents where, yes, the biggest ones that, caused the outage got fixed. But then, something the next level that would prevent the incident from happening again, people talked about it in the room, decided it was important, and then nothing happened, and so you go back and have another one. There is that in-between gray area. Yeah. So there are absolutely ones which is yes, we should update the documentation because it's incorrect, yes, and no one's going to remember to do it, and the actual things that caused the outage are on one end, but there's this in-between gray area. And I think that's where I think actually someone, you have the engineers making their best judgment call, but then there might be, the gray area is the tension where, yes, they can sort of ignore this and put it on the backlog or go work on the feature, and that's where you have to sort of kind of put in the right norms, yes, we want you to work on the feature, but we also want you to work on this thing that will prevent the next incident. And that's the right sort of prioritization that I think is the leadership.
I think that point around why do we track them is genuinely really an important one. And I think the thing, you might be right, Colette, right, which is that this stuff's happening regardless of whether it's tracked or whether it's not tracked. And so why track things? And I think the way I look at this is no team exists in a vacuum where they are able to sort of work, locally optimizing for themselves, right? Or no, that's not how broader systems work, right? So engineers could be great, I don't need to track this because you just need to trust that resilience is happening. It's all going on behind the scenes. But that's kind of not how, I don't think that's how the real world works here, right? Which is people need to be able to report either up to leadership, or maybe you're a regulated entity and you have an incident and someone is literally like, if you're not doing something off the back of this that you can communicate, I have no confidence that the right things will happen. And so I think that's honestly where I see a ton of the tension happening here. And I think there is a very happy medium, which is like giving the ownership over the process. So it's not a top-down, like, I need 5 action items. It is like, folks, like, you have an incident debrief, you decide the action items, you take away, like, I'm a big believer of, like, soak time is a super important thing, because you get the recency bias of, like, sit a bunch of engineers in a room and it's like, let's all figure out what we could do that would make this never happen again. And it's super easy to go, here's 40 things. And then you go, well, how do they stack up against everything else that my team has to do that is also generating a bunch of, like, reliability and resilience and things? And that doesn't often happen. And so I think it is like, generate things, give it soak time, cull the things that are not important, and then communicate the things that are important to sort of satisfy the broader organizational needs. Is broadly like my thinking on the thing, which is, I think, a good balance of the, like let the right things happen, but also let the right reporting and the right things happen up the chain. Anyway, we are 9 minutes from the end. This is going way faster than I expected. Let's talk about probably like one of the most hot button topics. So I think incident metrics are like super evocative. We've already covered things like MTTR. I think if we look at this at the core, like, metrics are there because we have such messy data in the world of incidents. There is like often hundreds of things going on over a month. You know, many of our organizations that we work with have that sort of scale. And it's like, how do I communicate to folks around an organization, like, what is going on? What is the narrative that I set without having to sort of spend hours and hours sort of giving people all of that sort of examples there? And MTTR is a super interesting example, because I think there are still a lot of organizations that are hooked on this as a metric, which is like a valuable thing. And it makes sense to me, right? Which is, it is super intuitive. It's like, how long are my incidents going for? I obviously want that to go down. Like, that makes perfect kind of like logical sense. I've read all the papers. I think everyone here is sort of like intellectually honest enough to know, like, this is probably not a good metric to be targeting people on and trying to drive that stuff down. But like, I guess, like, to bring this around to sort of land a question, like, Dawer, you have run live operations at a bunch of places. You reamed off a bunch of games everyone will be well aware of. Like, when it comes to like incident data, what are the things that you care about? Like, what would you end up actually looking at that you find useful?
MTTR. 100% kidding. I agree. I agree. Colette said it better. It's horseshit. It's really about, because the problem with metrics like MTTR is that it's the M. It's the average, and you're not looking at the worst and the best. And so, you know, we want to celebrate successes. Hey, we did a good job here, but it's really focusing on, like, what are the learnings? What incident can we best learn from? Mm-hmm. Like, where did we, like, what did we do well, and what instances didn't we do well in? And so looking at those sorts of things, and so and having a bit more of a, you know, like a communal discussion with folks in terms of, okay, which ones should we highlight? Where are some of the wins and losses in that respect? And what are some of the things we're choosing to do and not choosing to do? Because similar to the previous topic, like it's okay that we don't do things. It's okay that we're not going to follow up on certain things. But there's a cost. There's a cost to do something, and there's a cost of not doing something. And so ensuring that we kind of have the right measurements around, like, what's giving us the best indication of, like, okay, well, in gaming, you know, live operations or reliability, like, I see our role as like protecting the player experience. So how have we done that? Like, what things have we put in place? What generally, like, how available has our systems been, either from a game code perspective or from a platform perspective, and kind of like trying to find those signals that can best lead us to, like, getting to the bottom of, like, okay, what things should we put in place and help prioritize and discuss with those engineering teams, okay, say, hey, can we please prioritize this over some feature work? Because I know it's a tough thing, and that can be a very tough discussion to have. And I'm kind of being general about this because it kind of depends on the business and the type of business that you have. Like, it's different for gaming, and it's kind of different for, like, a payments company to a certain degree, because, you know, bunch of things, right? Like, all those compliance issues and whatnot. And so, but it's really about, like, what is most impactful to the customer, but also what's also impactful to the internal teams. Like, the last thing you want to do, what you want to have a beat on as well is how much how much strain is this putting on your teams? Because I mean, I think COVID's taught us everything. It taught us a lot in the past couple of years that really focusing on like people's health and like especially when you're working remote and not in the office anymore, like a lot of people are. Like sometimes you're working all day, all night, and you just don't realize it, right? And so trying to be mindful of that impact that you're having on your own staff, as well as like the hopefully the impact you're having to to your customers in that respect. So that's kind of where my head's at.
Nice.
I love those. Especially like the stress on your team, like hours worked, especially off hours on incidents. I love time to muster or like time to be actually responding to the incident as a collective, right? I think that's really useful to understand how long does it take us from detection to when we're all able to get together and talk about this and figure out what's going on. The right people are in the room.
What do you do with a metric like that one? So if you're like, is that just like an interesting data point? Because I agree, I think it's interesting, right? Which is like, did it take us ages to find the right people? Was that like some like organizational context that we're missing? That like it sort of paged Colette, and then Colette had to ping Uma, and Uma had to get Dawer, and we were like slowed down because of that.
Yeah.
Like, is that the kind of the conclusion of like that was a long time?
When my product VP comes to me and says, I want to take this to 3.5 nines, I can show him how long it took for his team to respond to an incident and say, 3.5 nines is going to cost us this, like we're going to have to ask people to act this much faster, where like I can take them down the chain of like how it works in order to actually achieve the level of nines that like my product leaders are asking for in terms of reliability.
That's awesome. Yeah, Uma.
One that I really like that Stripe used, they probably still use it, was actually users having a bad day. And the idea was, because I think all of this really, and both of you are kind of alluding to it, which is like with the nines and like other stuff, like all of this is really about user impact. So it isn't like, like it doesn't matter if you have any number of nines if a user is unhappy, and that's like your most important users, or vice versa. Like your users are happy and your engineers are getting paged all the time. Like neither, like those are like two really bad extremes. So I think using both user impact and then sort of engineering health, like how many times are your engineers getting paged? We actually started splitting nighttime versus daytime pages and trying to drive down the nighttime pages, like we're like going through the root causes, like were they false alerts? Turns out a category was false alerts, and so we shifted them to paging during daytime, things like that. So focusing on the sort of those two audiences, that's your team and your users, because that's, I think, the two most important stakeholders in the incident space, basically.
Yes.
And I think incidents have like this bad rap of being, all the metrics seem very punitive.
Yep.
Right? It's like, oh, you did a bad job because, whatnot. But I think it's really, good metrics are about highlighting the hotspots in terms of like, hey, where are areas that we need to kind of focus in a little bit more, again, blamelessly if we can, as to maybe we have a break in our PagerDuty escalation policy, where it's paging the wrong person or something like that. Like, but what's going to tell us that? And it's not because someone did a bad job, but maybe like, life happens or whatnot, or maybe we have to accommodate for the fact that there's a quiet period coming up or a change freeze coming up or something like that. And so that's sort of where, like, ideally, like, it would be good to kind of head in that kind of direction. I think like other metrics, like we talked about this earlier in terms of like number of incidents, like trying to reduce the number of incidents we have per period. I was thinking about that, and I kind of flip-flopped on it, going, no, we should never do that. What's the point of tracking? Because you can't really prevent number of incidents. But then I thought about it some more, and it made sense, because if you're looking from a customer experience, our customers do not care how many incidents we have. They don't care. Well, because all they care about is the service up? Can I play the game? Can I make a payment? Etc. Right? But looking inwards, I was like, actually, I do care if like this one engineer has 10 incidents that he got paged for a month, right? So there's certain things that we do want to track, the number of incidents, but not from a necessarily a punitive perspective, but also like, hey, this is an area that we should like pay attention to, because I think Jim over here shouldn't get paged like 10 times a month. That's kind of bad for him in that respect. So
yeah, I think that's a very powerful point. I think the way whenever I talk to people about like incident data and metrics and sort of insights, when people are like, what numbers should I look at? Well, I'm like, whatever leads you to the most interesting avenue to have a starting point for an investigation is the thing. It's like rarely these things are like deliberately lossy. They are modeling like messy data with humans and things like that. And it's essentially, how do I like narrow the focus in some way to find a thing, which is often actually how I end up like showing that MTTR is like largely useless, which is like, how many times have you looked at the graph and gone, oh, that's interesting, I can go do a thing? It's like almost never. And when it is, you go, oh yeah, there was that really bad incident. Like we know that took forever. That drove up, MTTR for whatever reason it is, kind of thing.
Well, and to be clear, MTTR was created, as far as I know, Dawer created MTTR as a way for organizations to track their journey in sort of the DevOps, like continuous deployment space, right? And so if you're an organization that's been running ITIL and doing, weekly releases or monthly releases, then maybe, yeah, MTTR is a good thing for you to monitor as you go through that transformation as a way to understand if you are successful. It is not a good way to monitor whether incidents are causing too many problems for you, right?
For sure. I'm getting an angry red light down here, which is saying we have exhausted the entire 45 minutes. These folks will be around for the rest of the day. I will also be around. If you'd like to talk about any more of this, definitely grab us, and we'd love to talk. Thank you, folks. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.